It began as a routine investigation into a remote settlement tucked deep within the dense shadows of the Black Forest, where the ancient trees seemed to whisper secrets of a time before man, and the local authorities had received no communication from the village of Altheim for over 72 hours. The silence was not merely a lack of phone calls or digital signals, but a profound and heavy void that felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the valley, leaving behind a chilling stillness that defied every law of nature and human behavior. As the first response team crested the final ridge overlooking the stone cottages and narrow cobblestone streets, they were struck by the sight of laundry still hanging limp on the lines, and the smell of wood smoke lingering in the air despite there being no visible movement anywhere. The lead investigator noted that even the birds had ceased their singing, and the usual rustle of the wind through the pines had vanished entirely, replaced by a pressure in the ears that felt like being submerged deep underwater in a frozen lake. They stepped onto the main thoroughfare and found front doors standing wide open to the elements, revealing half-eaten meals on dining tables and chairs pushed back, as if the occupants had simply evaporated in the middle of a heartbeat. There were no signs of a struggle or a panicked exodus to be found anywhere in the vicinity, yet the absolute lack of even a single stray dog or a wandering cow made the hair on the back of their necks stand up in primal warning. Detective Hans Weber reached for his radio to report the anomaly, but found only a rhythmic, wet, pulsing sound emanating from the speaker, a sound that resembled a slow and labored heartbeat echoing from somewhere deep beneath the very earth they stood upon. His partner pointed toward the village square where a massive, ancient oak tree stood as the centerpiece of the community, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers toward the overcast and gray German sky. Underneath that tree sat the village elders in a perfect circle on the stone benches, their heads tilted back at an impossible angle, and their eyes wide open but staring at something far beyond the physical realm of the living. When Weber approached the nearest figure to check for a pulse, he noticed that the man's skin felt like cold parchment, and as he touched the shoulder, a faint trail of black mist escaped the man's parted lips, swirling into the air like a sentient shadow with a mind of its own. The mist did not dissipate in the cold mountain air, but instead drifted toward the other elders, connecting them in a ghostly web of dark energy that seemed to thrum with a low-frequency vibration that rattled the investigators' teeth and their gums. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a soft melodic humming coming from the village church at the end of the road, a sound so sweet and yet so profoundly wrong that it felt like a razor blade sliding across the surface of the brain. The two men drew their sidearms with trembling hands and moved toward the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary, noticing that the grass beneath their boots was turning a sickly shade of gray with every step they took toward the holy structure. The humming grew louder and more layered as they approached the entrance, transforming into 1,000 whispering voices speaking in a tongue that sounded like stones grinding together in the belly of a hungry beast. Weber kicked the doors open only to find the entire population of Altheim kneeling in the pews, their backs to the altar and their faces turned toward the entrance with expressions of pure, unadulterated ecstasy carved into their pale features. None of them blinked or acknowledged the presence of the police officers in their midst, instead continuing their rhythmic chanting while their fingers clawed at the wooden backs of the seats until their fingernails bled onto the floor. At the front of the church where the priest should have stood was a towering figure draped in tattered black robes, its height reaching nearly to the rafters and its face hidden behind a mask of hammered silver that reflected no light. The figure raised a hand that possessed far too many joints, and the chanting stopped instantly, plunging the room back into that suffocating silence that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the lungs of the two terrified men. You are late for the harvest, a voice echoed not in the air but directly inside their skulls, sounding like the dry rustle of dead leaves inside a coffin that has been buried for 100 years without being disturbed. The silver mask began to melt and shift into the likeness of Weber's own deceased mother, her eyes weeping a thick black ichor that hissed as it struck the stone floor and began to spread toward his boots like a predatory oil slick. His partner screamed as the villagers began to stand up in unison with a sickening sound of snapping bone, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets being manipulated by a master who had forgotten how humans actually move. They didn't charge or run, but drifted forward with a slow and inevitable grace, their mouths opening wide to reveal rows of needle-like teeth that had grown directly through their gums in the short time since the silence began. Weber fired his weapon into the crowd, but the bullets simply passed through the bodies as if they were made of smoke, leaving behind small holes that immediately began to leak that same dark sentient mist that had been inside the elders. The heavy church doors slammed shut behind them without a hand touching the wood, and the temperature in the room plummeted until the breath of the officers began to freeze into jagged crystals in the air before them. The silence is a gift for those who have ears to hear the master, the creature at the altar whispered while its silver mask fell away to reveal a void of swirling stars and absolute nothingness where a face should have been. One by one, the villagers began to collapse into piles of empty clothes and dust, their life force being sucked into the void of the entity until only the two officers and the towering shadow remained in the darkening sanctuary. Weber felt his own voice dying in his throat as the silence began to take root in his heart, a cold numbness spreading through his limbs that made the heavy metal of his pistol feel like a feather in his weakening grip. He watched as his partner was lifted off the ground by an invisible force, his body stretching and contorting as if it were being rewritten by a cruel god who found the human form to be a boring and outdated design. The walls of the church began to bleed a dark, salty fluid that smelled of the deep ocean and ancient graves, and the crucifix above the altar inverted itself with a violent crack that echoed like a lightning strike in the small space. "Document this for the world to see," the entity commanded as it moved toward Weber with a speed that bypassed the laws of physics, appearing directly in front of his face before he could even blink his fading eyes. The investigator felt a cold finger press against his forehead, and suddenly he saw the history of the forest, a timeline of blood and sacrifice where the village was merely a feeding ground for something that had existed before the stars were born. He saw the jinns of the desert and the demons of the north standing together in a dark council, planning the great silence that would eventually consume every town and city until the world was nothing but a quiet, hollow shell. When he finally regained consciousness, he was lying on the ridge overlooking Altheim, but the village was gone as if it had never existed, replaced by a perfectly flat circle of charred earth where nothing would ever grow again. His radio was sitting next to him, and it was still playing that wet, rhythmic pulsing sound. But now he realized it wasn't a heartbeat at all, but a countdown that was ticking toward its final, inevitable conclusion. He looked at his hands and saw that his fingernails were gone and his skin was turning that same parchment gray, and when he tried to scream for help, only a thin trail of black mist escaped his lips to join the wind. The authorities eventually found his vehicle abandoned on the roadside weeks later, but the dashcam footage only showed him walking into the trees while talking to someone who wasn't there, his face twisted into a mask of ecstatic terror. They searched the Black Forest for months using thermal imaging and bloodhounds, but the dogs refused to enter the valley where Altheim had stood, howling in a way that suggested they saw something the human eye could not perceive. The case was eventually filed away as a mass disappearance due to unknown environmental factors. But those who have seen the classified photos of the charred circle know that no gas or chemical could leave behind such a pattern of ancient runes. Late at night in the nearby towns, people still report hearing a soft, melodic humming coming from the woods, a sound that makes them lock their doors and pray to a god they hope is still listening in the growing quiet. The silence is not a lack of sound, but a presence that is waiting for the right moment to strike again. And every time a hiker goes missing or a remote village stops answering its phones, the shadow of the silver mask grows a little longer. You might think you are safe and you're well at home with your digital connections in your modern life, but the entities that took Altheim do not care for your technology or your disbelief in the ancient ways of the dark. They are the architects of the unexplained and the masters of the void, and they are currently looking for a new place to harvest the souls of those who think the world is a loud and busy place where they can never be truly alone. If you ever find yourself driving through the rural heart of Europe and the radio suddenly begins to pulse with a wet, rhythmic sound, do not stop the car and do not look into the rearview mirror to see who is sitting in the back seat. Keep your eyes on the road and drive until the sun comes up, because the moment you acknowledge the silence is the moment it becomes a permanent part of your soul, dragging you down into the gray earth where the elders still wait. The German village of Altheim is just the beginning of a story that has no happy ending, a narrative of supernatural hunger that will eventually find its way to your doorstep when the lights flicker and the air in your room turns cold. Sleep well tonight if you can, but remember to listen closely to the quiet parts of your own house, because sometimes the silence isn't just the absence of noise. It is the sound of something very old and very hungry finally arriving to claim what is theirs. The world is much older and much darker than the history books lead us to believe, and there are corners of this earth where the veil is so thin that the jinns and the shadows can simply walk through whenever they feel a certain craving. Altheim was not a tragedy or a mystery to the entities that consumed it. It was simply a dinner party where the guests were the locals and the main course was the very essence of human existence, served on a plate of cold, German stone. Now that you have heard the tale of the unexplained silence, you are part of the record and the entity knows your name, watching you through the static of your screen and the shadows in the corner of your vision as you sit in the dark. Do not turn around too quickly and do not check the closet before you go to bed, because the silver mask is patient, and it has all the time in the universe to wait for the next harvest to begin in a village or a city just like yours. The countdown on the radio is still ticking, and the black mist is still swirling in the depths of the black forest, waiting for the next curious soul to step over the ridge and ask the question that should never be answered by the living. May you never have to experience the weight of a silence that can scream. And may your voice always be loud enough to drown out the humming that comes from the places where the trees grow too close together and the sun never shines. But remember that the silence is patient and it is growing every single day, feeding on the fear and the curiosity of those who dare to look too deeply into the mysteries that were meant to stay buried in the cold, unyielding earth. The end is not a bang or a whimper, but a quiet transition into the void where the villagers of Altheim now spend their eternity, chanting to a master who has no face and a hunger that can never be satisfied by any amount of blood. Goodbye for now, but stay alert for the signs of the coming quiet in your own neighborhood. And never forget that the most terrifying things are the ones that don't make a sound until they are already standing directly behind you in the dark. The story of the German village is a warning written in mist and shadow for all of humanity to read, a testament to the fact that we are not the masters of this world, and we are certainly not alone in the vast and ancient silence. If the lights in your room begin to dim as you finish this sentence, do not be afraid, because the darkness is only the beginning of the journey into the unexplained, and the silver mask is already reaching out to welcome you home.